Now, before I get into the special effects for RWBY and how they've evolved and been implemented in each volume, I want to make this perfectly clear. I am not very knowledgeable in effects and other aspects of animation, as well as animation production. I'm going to try to convey this information as best and as clearly as I can. I might make some guesses and assumptions to help fill in the gaps of information I either don't have or couldn't fully understand. If you are versed in the fields of effects animation and visual effects, especially if it pertains to RWBY, please feel free to correct me and add onto the knowledge I present going forward. The envelope had definitely been pushed year after year with RWBY's visual presentation, and the 2D and 3D effects are just a small part of it. There are 3 other factors that contribute to making RWBY transition from looking like a work in progress to a completed product, which you've heard me mention 2 of these throughout the video already: compositing, layering, and lighting. Regardless of what effects are added to each shot of a given episode, these 3 aspects of RWBY's production are important to help realize the desired visuals of the series. This term had been mentioned a few times already, but to formally explain, the compositing stage, or comp for short, involves taking all the individual elements of a shot and manipulate them to get a completed shot that will then be placed in the edit. Compositing is typically used to manipulate each element of a given shot to achieve a desired look. This includes moving and recoloring already placed elements and adding in new elements to then do the same. This can also involve cleaning up shots and tracing out or rotoscoping undesired clipping.
We would have a character sit in a new way, like Sun on a rail.
and not just totally fucking break.
Well, the thing is like the animator, in the past, the animator would get to it and go, I can't stop the bottom of his shirt from clipping through the rail. I can't. I don't have the control for it. So we'd go, okay, I guess we're going to fix it in post or not do that pose. And now
and we were the compers who had to fix it at the time.
Exactly, yeah.
When a shot is ready to work on, we take the renders from lighting and we have a setup script, and it's constantly being changed and modified. So we create a template for every scene that has sort of like a look that's pre-built into it. And from there we go in and we do our color correction, we do our depth passes, we make it look like a finished shot. We have to do a lot of cleanup, we have to do a lot of tracing out, which we call rotoscoping, traveling mats, and yeah, I don't know, it gets pretty complex.
Effects can be created and implemented during the compositing stage of production. An example of this in action is the anime crying effects placed on RWBY and Weiss in episode 2 of Volume 2. Carrie is the one who actually accomplished this, back when he and others on the team wore more than one hat during production, but I found little on how he was able to do so. From the commentaries of Volume 2, the tears are actually textured onto the character models, and Carrie animated them during comp. You can actually see the non-animated texture on Weiss for a moment. Layering is actually done before compositing and is integral to make it all work. Layering basically requires placing each asset on a particular layer or its own layer. Sounds simple enough, right? Well, I initially thought the same and believed that CRWBY would have each asset be a part of a certain layer like environment, character, background, foreground, but the layering process is actually a lot more complex than that. Yes, each element is in a layer, but there can be a whole tree of them. Essentially, for RWBY, there can be 50 layers or even more than a whopping 100 layers found in a given shot. A single character model alone can have around 25 layers.
We use Adobe After Effects for compositing, and this is a fairly typical shot, a little more complicated than some of the simpler shots. And you can see we've got almost 30 layers active in the shot. But if I was to go into the character herself, let's look at Weiss in this example. This is a fairly typical setup for the character herself. We boost the whites of their eyes like that, and then let's see, here's the line layer, a little easier to see like that. And finally, the glints in her eyes, which are these little tinier dots. And then you add all those together and you get Weiss. So when you're looking at the top level, you're seeing 25 different comp layers, but considering each of the character layers, each of their weapons is another 8 to 10 layers. Really, you're looking at the potential for hundreds of layers in a typical RWBY shot.
The compositing team will then take all of that and manipulate each element in a given shot that are now in their own individual layers. The character silhouettes back in Volume 1, blurring a character's model, depth of field, all of those have been done during compositing thanks to layering.
A lot of the times the effects are done through compositing. That's the only time I'll open After Effects is like, I'll export this as the base, this because I knew Yang's hair would glow, and then put them together in After Effects as a pin layer with some blur, and you've got an effect. And maybe just the same for when she got later in her fight, base layer, hair layer, some effects exported from like a simple particle program, merged together, and you have the glowing effect. Same thing for like these explosions, which are actually just cards with pictures of the explosions on them. And I export those all separately. That's Particle Illusion, by the way, which has a beautiful library of pre-made effects that you can just choose from. Putting that all together, it looks like that. And that's really all you need. There's even some like texture error going on right here, or it looks like his pants exploded.
Then there's lighting, which is interesting to look through in RWBY's case, as for volumes 1 and most of 2, the scenes and characters were flatly lit. The shadows or shading on the character models were also textured in and not a result of light and shadow from a light source in the environment.
Blake as well, you know, it's very simple, and if you can tell here, the shadows are baked right on. Like, that's the shadow from her scarf to her neck. That's the shadow from her tailcoat to her skin. You know, everything for Blake is pretty much right there.
Volume 2 is where we would start to see cast shadows from the characters, but these shadows would not be cast onto the actual character models, mainly the environment. Sometimes shadows would just be 2D images at the base of a character's feet. Volume 4 is where we would see them actually have light and shadow affect the character models and not just the environment. Like with the visual effects, a whole team was introduced for the task. What Volume 4 brought to the table is called zone lighting. Volume 4 would have 2 light and shadow zones for each character. Some scenes at night would have a third zone for highlights, also known as edge lighting. This would go into full effect for Volume 5, which also introduced a 4th zone for color, which they used to fake and comp. Despite the change, lighting was actually pretty weird on a case-by-case basis for the first 4 volumes of RWBY. Volumes 2 and 3, for instance, had characters and their weapons be given different lighting. I mentioned this in a previous video on Volume 4, there are some scenes that would also have the characters given a different set of lighting when compared to the environment. I actually found out why this happened. The environments themselves have been lit in Maya using the physical rendering plugin Redshift, and the characters were lit in 3ds Max along with the previously mentioned plugin Pencil. They would get better at matching the lighting between the characters and environments from Volume 5 onward. One interesting detail about the lighting after the change to Maya and 3ds Max is how they have a light source in the scene that comes directly from the camera. This is to achieve what can be best referred to as beauty lighting. The goal is to remove ugly, distracting shadows from the characters' faces and bodies. Why would this be important? Take a look at YouTube movie reviewer Jeremy John's old videos and compare how much better he looks with good lighting in his current videos. After hearing all of this, one of you might want to point out the scene with Ironwood and Torchwick at the end of Volume 2 as an example of them using light and shadow like with Volume 4. Actually, this is a clever trick in which a semi-transparent box was placed in the scene that Roman would move in and out of.
It has to be perfect.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Also, he remembered one of my old tricks here. Like that shadow over Torchwick's face is actually just a partly transparent box, which gives the impression that he's sitting in shadows. Because we don't actually have lighting for the characters, so he just is penetrating a box that's partly transparent. That's a trick I told him, like when Austin did, like literally the first season with Ozpin and RWBY last year when he walks into the room through that door. It's a good thing he remembers this stuff.
Another one of you might bring up the scene of Blake and Yang in Volume 2 as well. This was done during comp by messing with the colors of the scene with maybe some overlays. One that I want to bring up is the God Rays in the scene between Weiss and Winter for Volume 3. At first, I thought the CRWBY placed extended triangular objects or cards that were given some transparency and attached them to the character's environment. But then I saw this. My mind was blown at that point. I couldn't think of how they placed these god rays in and somehow have them deform with the character's eyes. Until I remembered a video from gaming YouTuber Smitty in which this happened.
Beautiful.
Plums.
Oh my lord. Did you say plums?
So I think they got the god rays in through After Effects during the compositing stage of this scene. Not 100%, it's just my best guess. To end this section off, let's show a shot from RWBY Volume 8, Episode 12 that exemplifies these three aspects of RWBY's production.